It hadn't been talked about, a new contract for him. So this came absolutely out of the blue. It may well have been known in the tight circles around Manchester City, but certainly not further afield.
We woke up to breaking news though this morning coming from England, where Manchester City's disappointing season has led them to go deep into their pockets and focus on the future as they've decided to commit Erling Haaland as one of the centerpieces of the next decade. Haaland has signed an historic 10-year contract extension. His initial deal was set to run through to the summer of 2027, but his new extension will keep him with the club through to the summer of 2034. So with that in mind, we wanted to remind you some of the stats that this beast from Norway has achieved in his young career so far. So 246 goals in 308 career appearances, which span over, of course, his time at Man City. Prior to that, in the Bundesliga with Dortmund, Mulder in his native country, and Salzburg and Bayern FK. And, well, he's already got 11 career trophies. Incredible stuff. He has been the centrepiece of the Premier League since joining. He's been, I guess, a divisive issue in the sense of people say whether he's a traditional forward, do they need him, etc. But let's just talk about the deal in itself first before we get into all of that.
Yeah, what's the money? What are we talking about here?
Well, I don't know.
This is what we want to know.
Does it make sense, first of all?
It does make sense if you're Erling Haaland from his camp and his side of the things. It does make sense. Where else are you going to go from Manchester City? We've heard conversations of him flirting with going to Real Madrid, but that doesn't look like it's going to happen for some years right now because they've just rebulked up their striking options and they've still got young players who are coming through and starting to grow and mature. So I can't see that happening. So right about now, what Manchester City are building, why not put yourself there to be the main focal point, the biggest part of their foundation, and also get paid for it, get rewarded for the form that you've shown since you've been at Manchester City. So for them, it makes sense. For the club and for him, it makes sense. But also, I'll pay attention to the length of the contract for me. I think it's a loophole that's been discussed when it comes to the PSR side of stuff in the Premier League, which we're starting to see a lot of clubs be affected by it.
Chelsea starting that trend.
Chelsea, they call it the Chelsea loophole, and I feel that Manchester City are using that for their benefit. But if you're Erling Haaland, you're not going to complain. You know, it's the longest contract in Premier League history, and it's also the most lucrative contract in Premier League history. I think Tony and I were talking about it. It's reported to be £500,000 a week, and that also includes image rights. He's just won the treble. He's the first team in the English Premier League history to win 4 consecutive Premier League titles. Let's see how the motivation side of things is going to work for him now to get up a bed and to perform and want to achieve great stuff.
And he's 24 years old, won the Golden Boot in his first 2 seasons with the league. How about you? Does this make sense for him? You know, is there really another club that he could go to in Europe?
Exactly. It's only Real Madrid that you would look at as the focal point, right? There's not many places that are higher up than Manchester City. You're in a great environment, a team that's clearly investing, even when things don't go well. You see what they're doing in January with how much they're going to splurge, so he's going to have a solid team around him. And I think it shows the belief that he has in this project. There's so many rumors about Pep Guardiola, where he's going to go.
He knows his future.
And he knows he wants to stay at Manchester City. So I think from Erling Haaland's side, of course, he's really happy with this, and it's a good thing for Manchester City fans to see. But I think for me, it's all about the focus on that project. If you look at Real Madrid, you mentioned it perfectly. They have all youngsters. They've got Endrick coming up. And
Real Madrid,
Real Madrid, So maybe they're not going to put him at the center. Manchester City.
But let's be real. Let's put that on the human side of it, because I know when people say this about football, do you really think it's the project or it's the fact of the numbers that came in front of him and you're already at Manchester City? Do you really care about the project building? Because there is...
You'll buy into the project at 500,
but there is also
500,000 a week,
But there is also a clause for him to leave in there. So there is a clause there later on in the contract. So there's no guarantee he's going to see out the entire length of his contract. So I think for me, it's more than anything, it's where else are you going to go? Like, you've got the luxury, absolute luxury of being at Manchester City, the money they've invested in the club and everything else. The project is not really your responsibility. It's the
but you want to be playing at the highest level. You don't want to put yourself in a position to not fight for titles.
You're playing in the Premier League. You're playing in a team that's expected now to compete for a Premier League title every year.
Which other coach would he want to play for in world football right now?
But that's another conversation. How do we know Pep Guardiola is going to... Yes, he's just signed a new deal, but how do we know he's going to be there for the full 10 years? You signed 10 years. So that we don't know if the next manager's going to come in.
Just for the foreseeable future, he at least knows that Pep, who's managed to make him, as I mentioned, Golden Boot winner, treble winner within the first couple of seasons at Manchester City, will be there to see what we believe will be a new period, a new project for the club, because looking at Haaland committing his future, it seems that there are changes happening around him. Of course, you've got players who are older who are going to be phased out, like Kyle Walker, it seems, who's about to leave in this January transfer window. Which players do you think will be key around him and obviously have been linked with the club that might be coming over, that will be exciting for him?
This is the list of the transfers. With regards to Erling Haaland, there's very few places for players like him to go these days. We talked about Real Madrid. PSG is another one that could spend money, and the reality is Saudi Arabian Pro League, right? And he's not going there. These are the only places that these types of players we haven't seen this, right? At $500,000, £1,000 a week, there's very few options for you. You're not going to Como, as much as they're the richest team in the world. You're not going to Newcastle. No, Como is the richest team in the world. Newcastle, richest ownership. Newcastle. So you're not going to those places. There's very few options for Erling Haaland. Will he buy into the project? No doubt about it. He has been the major part of the project, right, for Pep Guardiola. Do we see Pep staying for 10 years? Likely not. Pep hasn't showed a history that he stays. I mean, he looks like now he's almost wearing out, although I think he'll stick for this next part of the project. But this is a massive, massive deal for City. You've got the premier goal scorer in the world that you've locked down, the toughest position to lock down for me.
What's been the reaction on the ground there?
I think one of huge surprise, Anita. It hadn't been talked about, a new contract for him, so this came absolutely out of the blue. It may well have been known in the tight circles around Manchester City, but certainly not further afield. Astonishment at the length of contract. The money, he was already on top money anyway. We understand there will be a top-up to his wages, but it's the length of the contract and the commitment from the player himself. I got to say, I liked the way it was announced with various videos. I saw you showed just now the Lotus position in the snow. There's also one he's done where he's writing a letter to opposing defenders saying, sorry, guys, bad news, I'm staying, interlaced with loads of his goals. And again, a little bit of showbiz from Manchester City. And they've got this about them, showing him actually in the boardroom and signing and speaking to Khaldoon, the chairman, on the phone saying it's done, etc. So, yeah, they've done it with a flourish. And also what I've enjoyed about the news today, as it comes out, is actually hearing from Erling Haaland himself. Now, I know, Anita, you will have interviewed him on Champions League coverage or elsewhere. He's not somebody who seeks the limelight at all. He is an extremely humble guy. And I just felt with the various interviews that we've seen so far today, we just got to see a little bit more of the real person, if you like. Understandably, when he first came, he was a bit reserved. The answers were a little bit short, and he wanted to... He was fairly guarded, shall we say. Certainly that was my experience with him, although still good fun and a decent guy. But when he says, things like, this really feels like home for me now, and I can fully focus on getting better. I think that speaks volumes for him as a person, because what he's saying is forget, because there was this kind of expectation he'd be here for a few years and then be cherry-picked by Real Madrid, was often talked about within a couple of years. But he's saying, no, I'm here now. This is me. This is my life. It's a massive commitment from him and also the club as well. But I thought he came across as a person really well too.
You know what's interesting, Geoff, is I actually did interview him for the first time last week, and it just struck me how down-to-earth he is. It's so easy to hate him if he's not on your team, because you mentioned about one of those announcement videos, he causes absolute terror for rival defences. But if you are a Manchester City fan, you would be so happy, so over the moon that he will be part of this next project that Pep Guardiola will be unfolding there. But in terms of the Premier League itself, how big a character do you think Erling is in making people want to lock into that league week in, week out?
Well, they'll be over the blue moon. Let's be specific.
Very good.
He's one of the biggest stars of the Premier League. He's a star on a global stage. Look what he's won in his short time at the club. And every time he turns out in a Manchester City shirt, that gives opposing defenders and opposing coaches massive problems. You've only got to look at his numbers. Yes, the current numbers aren't great, but then again, neither are Manchester City's as a team. I saw another interview with him just now where it was put to him, you can go after Alan Shearer's goal scoring record. You got 79, he's got 260, obviously a long way to go. And he just smiled. He said, look, I just think about the next game. He said, of course, I'd love to have that conversation in a few years' time. And it would be great to get there, but it's not something I'm chasing. He's not somebody who sets records. But I genuinely think, and again, I don't know if you got a sense of this, Anita, when you were with him, he does have, and joking aside from the Lotus position, he does have an almost Zen-like approach to life. He can ignore all of the noise around him, all of the hype. He knows who he is. He knows he's true to his own values, to his family and to his friends. And the rest he gives pretty short shrift to. I mean, that, honestly, I don't think it's a gimmick. I genuinely think he is like that as a person.
He is, Geoff. He is. When I spoke to him, I asked him, you joke about this Lotus pose when you're scoring goals, but do you actually tap into meditation as a way to try and get that edge and be more focused on the game? And he said, definitely. He said he actually pointed to the fact that there's like so many things going on in the world. Obviously, he's got pressure being that focal point for Manchester City, trying to get the goals as he's already set standards so high. But he said just as an overall kind of view of how things are, the news we're constantly seeing, he does try to get into a place where he's very mellow and calm going into games and just also being focused in life.
And that would be a part, if you think about it, of the club's decision to give him this extraordinary, I mean, it's an absolutely extraordinary length contract. I know we've seen it starting to happen with Chelsea, but elsewhere, it just hasn't happened. This, a near decade extension to his contract. The fact that they look at him and they think he's not the sort of person that this will change. The length of the contract or the money, he will stay exactly the same. Nothing will vary at all. I think that plays a big part in the club's decision to reward him with that contract.
Geoff, I know we might be speculating a little bit, and we brought it up when we started the show, but do you think this has any indication towards the charges and this big cloud that's looming over Manchester City's head that they're giving such a long contract to Haaland?
Marco, I think it's impossible to ignore it. It must be a sign that the club are confident with regard to their position on those charges. Because look, first and foremost, Manchester City as a club have very, very deep pockets. So I don't think that the financial aspect of it would be something that they would take into account in terms of where they're going to be in the next couple of seasons. But to offer a player a 10-year deal, they would have to feel pretty secure as to their position in the Premier League. You would have thought. The one question I didn't hear asked in the press conference or asked Erling Haaland, what is the position? Now, we understand that the release clauses that he has in his current contract, they've gone. Apparently, there's a break clause in 5 years' time, I think, or 29 or 4 years' time. But the buyout clause is very, very high, so unlikely that it would be met. I'd like to know, was he asked directly, if the club are relegated because of punishment, does that affect your contract? I don't know whether or not that conversation has taken place, but from the outside, it would appear not. Now, that is a real show of commitment, and I agree with you. It must show a belief from the club that they will not be punished unduly or indeed relegated from these charges.